Hey y'all, it's entry number 21 of this offseason series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on A.J. Dillon, running back, Green Bay Packers. We'll start with the positives with A.J. Dillon's fantasy profile. To start, we have to talk about how he showcased some dual threat potential last year. We've known that A.J. Dillon would be a solid runner at the NFL level since his college days because of his build, and he proved that last year on the ground as he carried the ball 187 times for 803 rushing yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. But besides being effective in the ground game, we also saw A.J. Dillon prove that he can be a capable pass catcher, as he caught 34 passes on 37 targets for 313 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. The pass catching usage and performance was what I was most excited to see from A.J. Dillon in 2021, as one of the main concerns going into the 2021 season was that he was unproven as a pass catcher. By being both effective on the ground and in the passing game, it raises the fantasy potential of A.J. Dillon going forward as a player. Next up on the positives from A.J. Dillon's fantasy profile is that he's got a very good offensive line. The Green Bay Packers offensive line ranked 14th last year according to Pro Football Focus, which was pretty good considering they had some key injuries to the group throughout the year. Going into the 2022 season, they are projected to be the 5th best offensive line in the league, according to Pro Football Focus, now that left tackle David Bakhtiari is expected to be fully healthy. The last major thing I like about A.J. Dillon's fantasy profile is that he's got a running back friendly head coach. Matt LaFleur has generally done a good job of utilizing and getting production out of his running backs over the course of his career, and it showed last year as both Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon got a decent amount of touches. Having an offensive play caller who has a history of getting the most out of his running back room should only help A.J. Dillon in 2022. Moving on to some of the concerns with A.J. Dillon's fantasy profile. To start, we have to talk about how Aaron Jones eats into his potential workload. The Packers will still have Aaron Jones in 2022, who has been a very effective back in recent years. Over the last 3 seasons, Jones has totaled 608 carries, 2,987 rushing yards, 29 rushing touchdowns, 148 receptions, 196 targets, 1,220 receiving yards, and 11 receiving touchdowns according to Pro Football Reference. As long as Jones is healthy, he will warrant touches in this offense, and that could potentially limit the workload that Dillon sees. The next major concern with A.J. Dillon's fantasy profile is whether or not the Packers offense will be as good in 2022 as they were in 2021. The Packers traded away their star wideout, Davante Adams, this offseason, and will have a lot of unproven pass catchers on the team going into 2022. In addition, the team lost their offensive coordinator from the 2021 season, Nathaniel Hackett, as he left to become the Denver Broncos head coach. With these key losses, there are some questions on if the Packers offense will still be a top 10 offense in 2022. If they do take a step back as a whole, that would likely impact the number of scoring opportunities for A.J. Dillon. The last major concern with A.J. Dillon's fantasy profile is his positive run percentage in 2021. According to RotoWire, A.J. Dillon had a positive run percentage of 88.8% during the 2021 season. This was one of the lower marks in the league for a running back, and if he's not as effective as Aaron Jones in this area, it could affect the touches a little bit. Some additional thoughts on A.J. Dillon. During the 2021 season, A.J. Dillon was RB21 in standard with 151.6 total fantasy points, or 8.9 fantasy points per game, RB23 in half PPR formats with 168.6 total fantasy points, or 9.9 fantasy points per game, and RB23 in both PPR formats, with 185.6 total fantasy points and 10.9 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats during the 2021 season, A.J. Dillon had 1 out of 17 games with negative fantasy points, 3 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 17 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 4 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 2 out of 17 games with over 20 fantasy points, according to Fantasy Data. A.J. Dillon had 39 carries inside the 20, which tied for the 11th most in the NFL, 21 carries inside the 10, which tied for the 13th most in the NFL, and 10 carries inside the 5-yard line, tied for the 14th most carries in the NFL during the 2021 season, according to Pro Football Reference. In 2021, A.J. Dillon averaged a broken tackle every 11 rushing attempts, which was the 12th best mark in the NFL, and had 17 broken tackles overall on the year, which was the 11th best in the NFL, according to Pro Football Reference. Personal opinion: A.J. Dillon is currently going off the board as RB31, about pick 98 overall on ESPN, and RB26, about pick 67 overall on Yahoo. With ESPN's ADP on him, I ask, how and why is his overall ADP so ridiculously low right now? This is a guy that played at or a near equal level with Aaron Jones in a lot of areas during the 2021 season, and he's in his physical prime at 24 years old, and he's 250 pounds and ripped, and saw his offensive line improve by getting Bakhtiari back healthy. With Davante Adams gone, I anticipate that the Packers more heavily lean on the duo of Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, and figure out even more ways to have them both on the field at the same time, since those are their two best playmakers on the offense by far. He's already shown that he can perform at a low-end RB2, high-end flex level with Jones, and if Aaron Jones misses time this year, you are looking at a bona fide RB1. I love A.J. Dillon this year, and will have plenty of shares of him in 2022, especially on ESPN. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause that the player is passionate about. A.J. Dillon's My Cause, My Cleats in 2021 was for Ribbon of Hope, whose mission is to be a financial, informational, and emotional resource for individuals with breast cancer in Northeastern Wisconsin. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you have a player that you'd like to see highlighted in the video format of the A Player a Day series, drop a comment below.